as the rising sun and morning fog spar for supremacy on Fisher's Island Sound. Two 90-year-old wooden sailboats slip from the docks in Mystic, Connecticut. Another day of sailing aboard a classic Herreshoff yacht has begun. Merging of form and function, a testament to perfection, a living link to past genius. These are the words that describe a Herreshoff yacht. "44th Street, mid-Manhattan, is where the New York Yacht Club has resided for over 150 years. Displayed in the club's model room are thousands of racing and pleasure boats, representing the evolution of yacht design from 1850 to the present day. Outstanding are 7 well-proportioned, beautifully formed America's Cup defenders, with the name Herreshoff attached to them. These boats represent 41 years of domination by 2 brothers in the America's Cup. John Bound Herreshoff, J.B., born in Bristol, Rhode Island in 1841, went blind at age 15 and started building boats professionally at age 18. Nathanael Green Herreshoff, N.G., Captain Nat, born in 1848, a frail, persnickety genius with the drive and inspiration of 10 men.
Reliance, the hope of America afloat. It was but a minute later than the appointed time, 5:30 o'clock, when the latest Herreshoff creation, the craft upon which devolves the grave responsibility of defending the America's Cup, started down the ways from the shop at Bristol. As the hull came into view, the bronze underbody shining fair and bright in the clean air, a murmur of admiration spread about and continued until the yacht was at her moorings. To the critical yachtsmen, it was the revelation of a mastermind in yacht construction, a concentrated development of the advance, power, speed. There was one sentiment, and it was embodied in "The Cup is safe."
The launching of the Herreshoff's Reliance in 1903 can be viewed as a symbol that well reflects the dynamism of New England at the turn of the century. Science had applied itself to industry, bringing to the populace unprecedented growth. Emerging from the dark days of animal power, steam engines fueled the Industrial Revolution. People flocked to the cities awed by the new technologies. The word skyscraper was coined to describe the towering buildings being erected to accommodate a growing nation. A flood of immigrants provided the manpower needed to construct these new cities. It was an exciting time to be alive. "50 years before the turn of the century, in a quiet, remote section of Rhode Island, John and Nat Herreshoff were born and raised on a rural gentleman's farm with 7 brothers and sisters.
Bristol in about 1850 was a rather sleepy coastal New England village. A lot of the inhabitants were engaged in the trade. They were farmers, coastal fishermen, and coastal traders.
Rhode Island was also engaged in global trade. John Brown, Nat and John's maternal grandfather, made a fortune in shipping. One of his routes was the notorious triangle trade. John Brown shipped rum to Africa, where he traded it for slaves. Then he traded the slaves in the West Indies for molasses, and traded the molasses back in Rhode Island for more rum. John Brown was eventually turned into the law by his Quaker brother Moses for this unconscionable practice. This and other trading, nonetheless, bolstered the shipbuilding industry in Rhode Island.
Bristol had been a center of the boat building industry for many, many years. And in 1850, many of those expert old craftsmen were still here and still working. And Mr. Herreshoff Sr., of course, was acquainted with a number of these men, and his boys, of course, had the advantage of, therefore, knowing them as well.
John, at an early age, showed an interest in building boats. Using money he had earned from selling his homegrown vegetables, John set up a woodworking shop in a barn behind the family house. It was here that he began construction on his first boat, Meteor.
John developed glaucoma in one of his eyes at the age of 7. However, this didn't impede him in anything that he did, and he continued on in his interest, particularly of working in his shop and working on boats and that sort of thing.
4 of John's brothers and sisters were also blinded by glaucoma.
Just around the time of his 15th birthday, he was frolicking with his brother Charles and accidentally struck himself in the good eye with a stick. And from that point on, he was totally blind.
Dear Mrs. Herreshoff, Dr. Lewis and I are of the opinion as to the course which will be best in regard to your son John. We do not believe the chances of him regaining his vision would be improved by puncturing the cornea to relieve pressure, and therefore do not advise it. John, I'm sure, will be more comfortable for his visit here, and I trust in the future his great natural ability will overcome his lack of vision. I am certain he will be a source of pleasure and gratification to you and his friends. Believe me, madam, very respectfully, your obedient servant, Dr. W. Williams.
15 for a boy is a crucial time period. Psychologically, there are all of these things coming down on adolescent boys, and to be stricken this way must have been absolutely devastating to him.
His blindness, though, came on while the Meteor was being constructed, and I'm told that he was for a while despondent, and perhaps his recovery from that came about when his father and mother urged him to continue with the Meteor project. And I think the completion of the Meteor and her sailing and all is what brought John to his later optimism and vigor for life from then on.
When John lost his eyesight, the little brother, who obviously didn't have a terrible lot of influence in his life, became extremely important. And that became his eyes.
At the age of 9 years, I began to be my brother's companion, to lead him about, or I should more properly say, to be dragged about. He had lost his sight a year before when he was 15. At the time, he had nearly finished building his first sailboat. My father helped John finish his boat, Meteor, 12 feet long. I then began my sailing career. John had the knowledge and will, and I had the sight. I was only a little puny boy, and it was a tough job for me and real brutal at times. for John had a violent temper when things did not go right.
Nat Herreshoff was made to accept responsibility before most people do, because he was only less than 10 years old when the media was finished. He did sail with John, and he was the eyes of the ship, and I think if John was sailing, Nat would tell him what was going on, and oftentimes Nat sailed the boat himself and became a very proficient and able helmsman at a remarkably young age.
When John lost his eyesight, the little brother, who obviously didn't have a terrible lot of influence in his life, became extremely important.
In those days, there was no real formal yacht racing like we know today, but as I understand it, their father and themselves never hesitated to try to beat some boat that they might just encounter, so that whether there were formal races or not, they were always racing.
They delighted in racing. They delighted in beating their father when they could. It wasn't long before these two Herreshoff boys began to claim all sorts of honors.